You need to stop using the word trauma that much. We get it. We get it. We get that this story is about trauma. For the record, I loved the A Court of Thorns and Roses trilogy. I loved especially book 2 and how it dealt with Feyre's trauma and her moving from Tamlin to Rysand. Was it particularly subtle? No. Was it a masterpiece? Also no. Was it entertaining as fuck? Hell yeah. Did it still manage to touch on a lot of serious issues and still manage to actually handle it quite well? Yeah. Nesta really grabbed my attention in the final book. She was a high point, so full of edges. There's so much to explore. She's so wonderfully rugged, you know? So I was really looking forward to her getting her own book. I figured it would be very different from Feyre. This book is difficult to talk about, but I'm going to try. There's a lot of stuff that displeased me, a lot of stuff that frustrated me, particularly because I thought this could have become a wonderful, wonderful book. But it falls flat for me for several reasons. But in order for us to even talk about it, we have to talk about the structure of this story. This book is smut, at least in part. If we summarize the plot, it's basically Nesta is the dumb fuck who fucks and dances and drinks in order to deal with her trauma. And then she is forced to live in this house where she can't do any of those things except fuck. But we'll get back to that. And then she starts training physically and starts meditating, and then she feels better, and then suddenly, boom, there's a plot. That is the structure. Very quickly, this human queen becomes a problem, and then she barely even manages to get on the scene before she is destroyed by Nesta, who is awesome. And then Feyre has a baby and almost dies, and then Nesta saves her, and boom, then we're done. Mostly though, Nesta and Cassian just have sex for like the first 60% of the book before the plot actually starts to turn up. I remember at 34% in, and I marked it in my Kindle, and I was like, wow, there's a plot, because I think that's when they start to talk about the dread trove. And it's just amazing how much time passes before anything actually starts to happen. If we're totally honest, the plot doesn't actually start until 75% in, when Nesta is forced into the blood rite. The smut was too much. Not because I'm a prude, and not because they were badly written, but because they didn't add to the plot or to the relationship dynamic. In fact, it spent so much time with sex at the beginning of the story that when there were some actually really important character moments by the end, where it would have made sense to actually delve into those sex scenes, it didn't, because we'd already had so much sex earlier that it was just like summarizing the sex. And I was like, no, wait, hey, that was actually important. I wanted to see their dynamic in that scene. But I have been known to complain about the lack of sex and erotica in fantasy stories. It's because I feel that I don't like the fade to black, unless it literally just is they had sex and nothing changed. But in many stories, when a couple has sex the first time, that does change their dynamic, and typically there would happen things that bring them together or bring them apart. There are character moments in sex scenes that could be explored, and I feel like we often miss out on that opportunity. Also, I just enjoy reading sex scenes, because who doesn't like smut? A lot of people don't like smut, but like I wouldn't mind a little bit of more smut. But this was too much, as I said, because it didn't further the plot and it didn't further the character arcs. I don't want my books to drown in sex scenes. I don't want my books to drown in romance. I want plots, and I want the romances to be supportive. But this was really just smut and romance, and it wasn't even that interesting because the tension between them felt... when I say the tension between, like, the thing that was keeping them apart felt very forced. Unlike with Rysand and Feyre, where it was like, at first Feyre doesn't trust him, then she learns to trust him, but even then they don't get together because she just left Tamlin and she is traumatized after all of the things that happened under the mountain, and she's not able to move into a relationship with Rysand until she has started to heal. So that felt real, and the moment she is ready to move into that relationship, the relationship actually starts. And then in book 3, you have them being in a relationship. Yes, half my language is body language. But here it was just like they started having sex, and then the only thing keeping them apart was the fact that they didn't sleep together after the sex, and it felt contrived. So I was frustrated about this book, not only because of the structure, which, I mean, honestly, it felt like reading a fanfic. That was what it felt like for much of the story. Until the very end, where things actually got interesting, then it felt like a book. But up until then, it just felt like we were in a fanfic. And especially because stuff would happen, and then the pace would die, because then we just returned to training with Nesta and the Valkyries. We'll get back to that. So it just kept starting and stopping, which was very frustrating. But another thing that it did was that it basically destroyed other characters, and it didn't use the potential that was present. Basically, what I would have liked for this story to be was Nesta and Pharaoh's story. The healing between them, Nesta coming to terms with the fact of how wrongly she behaved as a human, and sort of making amends for that. And the plot needed to force them together in order to do that. I would have liked Nesta to be like a dumb fuck who was like, okay, you put me in this tower, I'm gonna walk down, and when I can't walk further, I'm not gonna walk back up to Cassian who's grinning at me. I'm gonna sit right here and rest, and when I'm ready to walk on, I'm gonna walk down there. I needed Nesta to actually try to get back to her toxic behavior. She let go of it way too easily. This book, I know a lot of people are like, this really shows trauma and how healing from trauma works, but I was like, but she doesn't really behave very toxically for a lot of the story. She's just difficult to talk to. Really toxic behavior would have been like, okay, so I can't drink, fuck, and dance, I'm gonna fuck Cassian, and then kind of abuse him, misuse him for sex, and that would emotionally hurt him. See, that would have been real tension between them. That would have been a real thing keeping them apart, her using him to numb herself, and him slowly realizing it and feeling used by this woman that he loves. That would have been real hurt, and it would have been real toxic behavior. So I needed that. I needed Pharaoh to not be just totally sidelined by a weird pregnancy where it was like, you can't do magic. And it's like, why not? Haven't Fae sorceresses had children for ages? Why shouldn't she be able to do magic and take part of the job? And I don't take part of the plot, but I would have loved to see Pharaoh and Nesta be these maid women, go out and work together, and see pregnant Pharaoh be awesome, and see Nesta be like, wow, she's really overcoming all of the things that were in her way, and I want to do that too. But at the same time, Nesta would be struggling with her inner demons, and she doesn't want to change because people don't want to change, and they're gonna fight it. And Nesta is particularly stubborn. Like, if you try to change Nesta's mind, she's gonna go the opposite direction. And so I felt like her just changing her mind on her own was too weak. The plot needed to force her, because otherwise I didn't feel like it was that bad. She didn't really fight back. A Court of Thorns and Roses was already pretty dramatic, but this was melodrama. This was really just blowing small stuff up into huge proportions. And it felt out of place in this world, especially with the stakes and with like, we're gonna spend this much time on training and girls hanging out and stuff, and it's like, okay, but like, there's a war coming. You're supposed to find the dread trove and figure out what to do with them. And Rysand is just, no, I'm not gonna get into Rysand very much in this video, because that's for a separate video. I'm gonna make a separate video on Rysand and Pharaoh and how this book destroys their relationship. I had to go back and reread book 1 and book 2 because I missed who they were, and now they're just both horrible. The language was also worse. Sergei Maas has never been a master at this. It's like, she has scenes where she's very good at getting into the experience of the characters, but there's so much redundancy in her language, and so many awkward sentences, and so much over-explanation, which really drowns out the scenes. Concerning Nesta's lack of toxicity, I really don't like this trend of creating characters who are seriously flawed and problematic, and then when you get to their point of view, it's like, oh, well, they knew they were bad, they couldn't help it, and they're so hurt. Like, in real life, problematic people, toxic people think like they have a different perspective. They do things this way because they think a different way, and so in order for them to change, they have to change their way of thinking. And Nesta always had the way of thinking that she ends up with. She always knew she was hurting people, and she kind of wished that she would stop, but she can't stop. And I know that sometimes you're in a process and you're like, oh, you're realizing you're doing something bad and you're fighting it. But the problem here was more that she didn't fight. She knew and she didn't fight it. It felt like we were thrown into the middle stage of her journey. We needed to start with her being seriously problematic and toxic, and then work through that stage of her struggling to be better but failing, and then end with her being better and having a changed perspective. And the character arc was just so weak. So Nesta reads a lot, and she prefers reading smut. She reads a few military strategy books because female empowerment, like a few times during the book. But she likes smut, and more power to her. But she really reads nothing else. She's not interested in anything else. I know it's supposed to be like this fun little thing between her and the girls, but it just felt so weak. And especially tragic when Amari is like, oh, it's so great to finally meet another woman who doesn't just think about romance and children and stuff. And then it's like, okay, but your thing with Nesta is like that you read smut. And you read smut together and you exchange smut. Like, do you see the problem? Speaking of Nesta's new friends, I never really felt like Amari and Gwen really became characters for me. Not in the same way that the old group was, which made it particularly frustrating that we didn't focus on the main group a lot. And it was just like the conflict with them were just resolved when she resolved her inner demons instead of actually having confrontations. And it also really frustrated me that Feyre doesn't get to be frustrated with Nesta, because she's just like, oh, this is my responsibility. And then at the end when Nesta saves her and it's like, I love you, then Feyre is just like, I love you too and I forgive you. It's just like, where's the conflict? Where's the personality? Where's the character development? Where is Feyre? Like, our dear protagonist just disappeared from the story. I was a lot more invested in the drama between Nesta, Elaine, and Feyre than I was in these new characters. And I appreciate that Nesta needed to create her own family, but there were, like, why couldn't she get that and still actually develop a meaningful relationship with the other characters? The thing with Elaine was never resolved. And, like, none of the stuff with the family was actually very resolved. She just magically saved Feyre because Deus Ex Machina, and that was that, and it just felt so weak and like cheating, and and then there's the whole thing with female empowerment. Like, of course, Nesta had to go into the blood ride, and she and her friends had to win, and they became the Valkyries, and I was like, they trained for 5-6 months. I didn't need for them to win the blood ride in order to prove that they were worthy. They just needed to survive. And Nesta already being this freakish, magical being that she is, like, it felt like, oh, she has to be equal to Cassian in order to be his mate and in order to show that they're equal. But no, being equal in a relationship doesn't mean that one can do everything that the other can. In fact, making her win the blood ride makes her and Cassian unequal, because now she can do what he can, but she also can do strange magic, and it actually feels very unequal to me now. That relationship just feels very skewed. She's very powerful and mean, and I actually feel like the dynamic doesn't really work for me. Of course, I have to say, I do like how Cassian is very much the person who helps hold her together and helps heal her, and he can be tough with her when it needs to. I saw some people be very frustrated with Cassian about the scene where he says that everybody hates you, and people are like, oh, he needed to apologize for that, like he did, and people are like, oh, he can't just write it off like, I didn't mean it. But he gets to be mad at Nesta. She behaves horribly. Everybody gets to be mad at Nesta. And it's fair that he says that they are frustrated with her. Saying that they hate her is maybe not exactly correct, but they're all frustrated with her and they are hurt with her. And it was totally right for him to tell her those things, especially because it sparked something in her. It forced her to start thinking about things. People get to have fights. People get to say the wrong things. I really hate it when in stories it has to be this perfect thing. Like, for instance, in A Court of Thorns and Roses 3, where Rysand just became this perfect person who was both a he was both a rape victim and survivor, and he was also the savior of other rape victims. And it was just like, can the sympathy points get any higher? I don't need him to be this extraordinary, angelic person who just does all of these fantastic things, and in order to like him and think that Feyre should be with him. And I don't need Tamlin to become this insane beast person who is just so, destructive. I don't need that in order to see that Feyre would work better with Rysand. I've talked about that in my A Court of Thorns and Roses video, but it deserved a mention here that, like, this over-glorifying of characters is a problem because it makes the relationship less realistic. And I realized this book is very much a fantasy. Like, A Court of Thorns and Roses was already in the fanficky fantasy area, but this is too much. Like, we still need grit. We still need some realness to the story. And it's interesting that Sarah J. Maas clearly really cares about trauma and dealing with that, although you need to stop using the word trauma that much. We get it. We get that this story is about trauma. But it's interesting that she's so interested in these dark, gritty topics, and then the relationships are just so magical. The time aspect really seriously fucked with the story. So she had a few problems because she wanted Nesta to be strong enough to get through the blood rite, and she wanted the baby to come at the end. And then you had to, collide with each other. So a lot of the time it was like, stuff happened, and then 3 months passed, 2 months passed, stuff happens, 3 months passed. And it was really weird because in the beginning I felt like a lot of a lot of time was passing because we had a lot of very in-depth scenes and a lot of stuff was happening, but then we were told that only 2 weeks had passed. So, like, basically in 2 weeks, Nesta overcomes the biggest part of her trauma, which is starting to see that you need to change and starting to take those steps. And she and Cassian starts to have sex and basically begins their relationship. And it doesn't leave a lot of for development. And it leaves me kind of like, okay, so in 2 weeks she gets that far, and then she has to spend all of these months getting this tiny bit further. It was just frustrating. It would have been so much better if the plot had forced her and Cassian together, if the plot had forced her and Feyre together, and forced her and Rysand together. I really wanted a development between Nesta and Rysand. This was just frustrating. Him showering her with gifts at the end. Stop. The worst part in this book, the part that seriously pissed me off, is the part with... So Rysand finds out that Feyre is probably going to die from the pregnancy, and instead of telling her, more on this in the Rysand Feyre video, instead of telling her, he's like, we're all going to keep it secret while we search for a solution, because I don't want her to be sad. She doesn't have the right to know that she's dying. And then when Nesta reveals this to Feyre, everyone is so mad at her, and she's sent off to be punished, and Rysand is basically threatening her, and Cassian is so furious with her, and Nesta is so torn with guilt, and she goes on this trip into the mountains and realizes, like, I'm such a horrible person. And I'm like, this was the trigger? You mean that her telling Feyre what she had a right to know from the beginning was the trigger for this? I just don't buy that punishment, because she shouldn't be punished for this. Feyre should have been told from the beginning. A final thing about Nesta that really bugged me was, okay, so like Sarah J. Maas, as I said, really likes to make it clear to you that these characters are good. And so in A Court of Thorns and Roses, Feyre had this very annoying moment where they have to save Elaine, and then there's this one human girl who's being tortured, and then she's like, I can't leave her, and they save her, and they flee, and there's not really any consequences to it. They achieve saving Elaine. Tamlin does expose himself as being on their side and saving them, but Tamlin, there was just no real consequence to being so good. And likewise, Nesta had to have a dumb as fuck moment in the book while Azriel and Cassian are fighting. She's like, what if they're not okay? I need to get to them. And it's like, girl, you have no way of getting to them. So she crawls down from the tree, and she's on this little island, and then she goes to the water, and then of course the thing comes out of the bog and takes her. And I was like, well, yeah, duh. But the plot doesn't really punish her for it, because then she finds the crown and she wins and they all bow to her. You know how in D&D there's lawful good, neutral good, and chaotic good. Well, protagonists need a naively good, idiotically good. Cassian was honestly a little bit boring. The story tried to do something with him becoming a courtier, courtesan, but it never really got anywhere with it. He was bad at it from the beginning, he was bad at it at the end, and like how he taunts Eris, and it's so dumb, unnecessary. He was bad at it from the beginning, he was bad at it to the end, and they're like, Cassian doesn't have enough to do. Okay, we just had a war. And Cassian is trying to get the Illyrians to change, he's training them. And since there's this war maybe coming and Rysand wants to prepare Prithian and maybe gather the alliances, shouldn't the general of the Night Court be visiting the other courts and trying to work with the other generals, creating a united army of some sort? You know, he's a general! This whole book would have been so much more enticing with a proper plot and with proper character development. Everything was in place for this book, and it just didn't go there. And by the way, the story starts with Asriel being like, oh, he can't do the court stuff, even though he would be better than Cassian, because he's so busy. But then he finds time to train these ladies for 2 to 3 hours every morning. And Rysand, the fucking High Lord of the Night Court, who should be out developing alliances, he spends time every morning fucking winnowing Amari to the training. Stop! It would have been great if Nesta had taught herself winnowing. If the plot had forced her to start using her powers, she would have learned winnowing and she would have been able to herself get Amari. She would have wanted Amari to come, nobody would have time, so she would have to develop her powers. And seriously, Feyre's pregnancy is actually a great political power element, because now Rysand is gonna get an heir. Him going to see Helion and seeing Aquadude, Summer Court, King, Tarquin. Yes, exactly. Going to see Tarquin and being like, Feyre is pregnant and we're holding strong and we need to ally. And instead they just mope around for the entire book. There's so much to be done in preparation for this war and they're just doing nothing. Let's talk about Nesta and Cassian. Their dynamic was fun and sexy. I really liked how it was like they had this who wants it more dynamic going on. So that was fun, and them teasing each other. But imagine if that dynamic had been happening while there was a real plot. Instead of happening in a boring house, it would happen while they were on these adventures, being unable to actually really fulfill things because they wouldn't be alone and stuff. And look, I'm not really one for wanting characters to make dumb decisions all the time. I like for characters to think things through. I think my criticisms of this book underlines that, but I like when characters do dumb stuff because they're dumb fucks. What I mean is they have a perspective that distorts their view of things, making them do weird things, or they have personal motivations or personal feelings that make them do things. Tree thing, climbing down off the tree thing, is not part of this because there was no real punishment. There was no real consequence of that. The actions have to have consequences in order for it to be interesting. But I really wanted Nesta to go down the route of having sex with Cassian in order to forget. Maybe grabbing the mask in order to forget and stop feeling, because after she reveals things to Feyre, she feels so bad. That would have been the opportune moment for her to go and get the mask. And then Feyre would have had to come and go and be like, please take off the mask. And so many squandered opportunities. Why not create a plot where Nesta was forced into close proximity with Amren, Feyre, and Elaine, and perhaps Rysand, and of course Cassian. With all of them, right? Asriel is the only one she doesn't really have beef with. That would have been so much more thrilling. And I love the core characters. Those were the people I wanted her to actually get along with. We could still have had Amari and Gwyn, and we could have had the blood right as like this final thing to her character arc, but we need stuff along the way. And I really wanted a moment, I wanted Nesta's toxicness to build to this moment where Cassian would be like, enough is enough. Nesta, you need to change. I really thought that he deserved that moment and that she needed that moment. and I'm sad that it wasn't really there. We could talk about this in a rewrite video of A Court of Silver Flames if anybody's interested in that. It takes a lot of work, so. Imagine how much more interesting it would have been if Nesta and Cassia's sex scenes were sparsed throughout the book instead of gathered at the beginning, and then we don't even really get anything toward the end where it would feel better because the plot would have built up to it. And it would have been so great too with the group gathered, because Rysand is just does not like Nesta, and I love that he doesn't like Nesta, and I love that she doesn't like Rysand. And Cassian would have been caught in between them because he loves Nesta, but he would also be misused by her because she's using him for sex, and he knows she's doing bad things, but at the same time he wants to protect her from Rysand, and he knows that she's starting to get better, but Rysand is understandably very impatient with her and frustrated over the situation with Feyre. It would have been so wonderfully messy. One last thing before I wrap this up, because yes, I'm going to do a Feyre and Rysand video, but I just need to mention that it was so overdramatic with the pregnancy. Look, the baby's gonna die, Feyre's gonna die, and Rysand is gonna die because she dies, because of their fucking pact. There is one proper response to this situation, which is that Feyre transforms her womb in order to make it possible for her to give birth to the baby. Yes, apparently, for some weird reason, we're not really told why, this could endanger the baby. I don't see why making the womb better for him and his wings would be bad for the baby, but whatever. But you do it because it's the only way Feyre can survive and Vriss can survive, and yes, the baby might die, but like they could live to have another baby, and then she would not transform while they fuck. Yeah, you lose that baby, but you're gonna lose it anyway. But of course, we the readers knew Nesta was gonna fix it all with the Lady Death thing, right? So them waiting around really didn't have much tension at all. It was just frustrating and dumb, and like the thing with where the book was like, oh, Feyre was so brave because she doesn't cry about it, about impending death. Why wouldn't she cry? I mean, I'm so sick of this trope of I'll die for the unborn child trope, which was also done in Twilight, and it's just so bad. Especially when the father of the child and only High Lord who can actually protect Prythian will die as well as a consequence of this pact. Even if you somehow see this as murder, you sacrifice that child for, humanity or vanity or whatever. Let's put this in simple terms. The world, or baby that might survive, but Rysand and Feyre will both die. The world where Feyre and Vriss live, and they survive to protect Prythian and can have other children, where Feyre will be very, very careful about being in the right form when they conceive. Or baby that might survive and grow up in war-torn Prythian without a father who can teach him about his world-shaking powers and potentially world-shaking penis. The choice is easy. Okay, so let's wrap it up. The book was easy to read. I was entertained for parts of it. Nesta and Cassian were fun, but I'm frustrated. It could have been so much more. And that's the worst, right? It's so much easier if the book is just bad. But when the book had potential, and that potential was squandered, that's so much worse.